The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we're really blessed to have Peter Lavenda with us. He's a researcher and an author and a whole lot more. And I keep hawking his trilogy, Sinister Forces. If you don't have it, you've got to get it. And you can find it at sinisterforces.info. And tonight we're into part 2 of Ratline. And Ratline, Soviet spies, Nazi priests, and the disappearance of Adolf Hitler. Oh, Peter, you wrote quite a book.
Thank you.
Yeah. First up, I've got a couple of questions from a listener and a fan of yours. And he wants to know, what is the relationship, if any, between the Knights of Malta and the Vatican Ratline?
There's not a direct relationship in the sense that, you had the official Knights of Malta involved in the Ratline, but there's an unofficial relationship as these things usually occur.
Yeah.
Members of the Knights, of course, were very involved in the Ratline. They were very involved with supporting the Vatican in its endeavors generally. So you have various Knights involved. For instance, we know that many members, some influential members of the American intelligence community were members of the Knights of Malta, and at the same time are implicated in the Ratline as part of their intelligence duties or capacity. So we know there was crossover and overflow between the Knights of Malta and the Vatican and the monastery route of the Ratline. I think there's no question about that as far as individuals are concerned. As far as the organization as a whole, as far as like an official policy or something, of course, we will never find documentation where that's concerned. But we will find the fact that the Knights, because they are a conservative Catholic organization, for the most part, they were supporting the church's position where the Ratline was concerned, not just in Europe but also in Latin America. So you would find Knights who were prominent in Latin American social circles who were helping to establish or helping to facilitate the Ratlines in Latin America, particularly in Argentina.
Oh boy. Okay, question number 2 from a listener and your fan. What role did the British play in the Ratline?
Well, the Brits were, of course, running their own show where that's concerned. As I mentioned at Ratline, there was a famous case in which the British actually faked the death of a high-ranking Nazi war criminal, somebody that the Russians and the Americans wanted to stand trial at Nuremberg. And they basically faked his death, just like an old James Bond kind of scenario. There was fake documentation, a fake certificate of death, blah, blah, blah. They changed the guy's name, and they ran him into England so that he could work for them in an intelligence capacity, much the same way that the Americans used the Galen organization to run intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. Galen, of course, was a high-ranking Nazi intelligence officer. So they were doing the same thing, the Brits, on their own, as far as rescuing Nazis that they thought were high-value intelligence targets. So they would take them out of the mix so they would not stand trial. So there was one particular case, but there were others. The British were, how shall I put this? Latin America was the destination of choice for the Nazis who were leaving Europe. That was the basic place where they really wanted to go, and that was the American sphere of influence. So you didn't have a lot of British activity on that end of the Ratline. You didn't find their fingerprints anyway on what was happening as far as Latin America was concerned. there might have been some involvement of British intelligence in the Ratlines in other parts of the world, however. The Middle East would have been one particular place where the British would have had influence had they wished to exercise that influence in the Middle East, because a lot of Nazis wound up in Egypt and Syria, in Libya, even places like that welcomed the war criminals as they came out of Europe. So the British had a very strong presence in that part of the world, as well as in Asia. You know, we had Nazis running as far afield as India, possibly Tibet, and all the way into Southeast Asia, as my book demonstrates. So the British would have been aware of some of this, and I think that the British were basically following the American lead where this was concerned. I think Churchill was just so happy to have the Americans, enter the war on his side, that he was pretty much letting the Americans have a freer hand when it came to hiding Nazis for an intelligence purpose. And the British, of course, would have been only too happy to share in the intelligence product that the Nazis were giving the Americans, because both the British and the Americans saw the Soviet Union as the next big enemy, as the next big threat to European stability. So they would have cooperated. I don't think they had a very active role, but I think they did cooperate when cooperation was required.
Okay. And his last question is, was Hitler spared, do you think, because of British influence?
Well, the Ratline that I believe he, and of course, as we know, many other Nazis used, was pretty much an American creation. It started in Salzburg. It started with American intelligence there. As we've discussed, the Monsignor Dragonovich, that was pretty much an American-oriented operation. So I don't know if the British really wanted Hitler spared, unless it was for, again, some hidden agenda, some ulterior motive, possibly against the Soviet Union. But I think the Americans would have had a vested interest as well. I mean, they did deliberately, and in a way that's now very documented, assist so many top war criminals in their escape.
Why?
And if they didn't assist them, then they covered up the escape as well. So the recently declassified documents from the Department of Justice, just from about a year and a half ago, lists some of the war criminals that were assisted. Klaus Barbie being the most famous one, the most infamous one, perhaps, the Butcher of Lyon, a man who was responsible for war crimes in France and who lived out most of his life peacefully in Latin America until he was extradited to France in the 1980s. But, until that time, Barbie had the benefit of being protected by American intelligence, and he used the very same Ratline out of the very same location, out of the Salzburg office that my Georg Anton Pleuk, the Hitler person, used at the same time. So, I mean, American intelligence was obviously helping these people to escape. I mean, they had an interest. They thought the Soviet Union was the real enemy, was the real threat. The Nazis were notorious as being, hating communism, being literally violently anti-communist, and the Americans saw the communists as their next big enemy. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, to use that old worn-out expression. But in this case, it was true. The Cold War looked like it was going to be a shooting war, that it was going to heat up eventually. So we, wholeheartedly embraced the Nazis for intelligence purposes as well as for, of course, scientific purposes and Operation Paperclip and things like that. So our involvement with the Nazis is quite deep. We didn't need the British, to influence us too much in that direction. I think, we were in it with both hands and both feet, helping them to escape. So Hitler, though, was a different category, and I can understand your listener's question there. Hitler is in a different category. Hitler had no intelligence value, let's put it this way, and he had no scientific value.
Right.
This was not a guy who could offer much. to a war effort anymore, except as maybe a figurehead. So why would he have escaped? Why would the Americans have allowed it? I don't think they did. I don't think the Americans or even the British were too conscious of the fact that this was actually Hitler. I think what happened was the British, of course, covered up the whole story. It was a British operation from the beginning, and this is, I think, where your listener is coming in.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, the whole story that we have of Hitler's suicide starts with a British intelligence operation called Operation Nursery, and it was with a major in British intelligence, in MI6, in the Secret Intelligence Service, Hugh Trevor Roper. And he was given the task. He was given 3 months in which to prove that Hitler committed suicide. This was his mission: prove Hitler committed suicide, not find out what happened to Hitler.
Yeah.
You know, his mission was to prove that Hitler killed himself in the bunker, April 30th, 1945. Go and find the witnesses who will support this. Go and find any evidence that might support this, and then make your report. This was a British intelligence operation. So I can understand your listener's concern. The British were deliberately saying, okay, Hitler is dead. We need you, Major Trevor Roper, to go out there and, prove it for us in a way that everybody will accept. So he had 3 months to do this. He didn't speak German. He had no access to any of the prisoners of war that the Russians had or the Americans had. He only had access to whatever prisoners the British had, which was not much. And all testimony that he got was contradictory in some way. There was no, solid thread of narrative where this was concerned. Everybody was lying. They were lying their heads off. And when the Russian prisoners were finally released, the Nazis the Russians had, they had all kinds of different stories until they found out, which story everybody wanted them to tell, and then they changed their stories to fit. So this was a British intelligence operation from the beginning. Now, why would the British care? Why would they want to do this?
Yeah.
This is because Stalin in Russia was insisting that the British had Hitler, or that the Allies had Hitler, or that the Americans had Hitler, and were you going to use him in an offensive against the Soviet Union somehow to fire up the German people again or something. So Stalin was insisting that he had no evidence Hitler died, and that the Allies were hiding him. So the British concept was, let's go and prove that Hitler is dead. That will shut Stalin up, or at least prove to the world that we don't have Hitler. What's funny is, this was a British operation. The Americans were not involved. And Eisenhower himself expressed doubts as to whether or not Hitler had committed suicide. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, never believed it. He believed that Hitler had escaped.
Yeah.
So everybody is believing that Hitler had escaped or survived the war in some capacity, except for the British story. So the Brits were insisting that Hitler was dead. The Brits had no evidence either. They had no access. They didn't have access to the bunker before the Soviets. They had no clue. So they're going on, and they've decided that Hitler is dead. Now, why would they do that? To prove to Stalin, to shut Stalin up, to say, okay, Hitler is dead, Stalin, shut up, let's get on to the next phase. So was this an intelligence operation directed against Stalin? Was this a disinformation campaign designed to discredit Stalin and thereby discredit the Soviet Union, their former allies, against Hitler? So were they trying to screw with, Stalin's agenda? Was that all that was involved? I mean, the Brits do have this taste for the pernicious, when it comes to this stuff. They are kind of manipulative and cynical where these things are concerned. And they had an abiding distrust of the Soviet Union. So maybe this was just simply, a game that they were playing. Maybe they had no idea whether Hitler had escaped or not. Maybe they had no clue about it and they didn't care. Their goal was to shut Stalin up and say, Hitler's dead. And the funny thing is, they didn't get the Americans to buy into it.
Yeah.
American newspapers in the months and in the years after the end of the war were full of stories saying that Hitler had escaped. They were full of very serious investigative journalism, saying, we don't have any evidence, we don't have any proof. There have been Hitler sightings here and there. It's possible Hitler escaped. Some important generals on Stalin's staff were going around saying they believed Hitler had escaped. There were Nazis that had been captured saying they believed Hitler had escaped. Otto Skorzeny, who actually ran the Ratline in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 60s, was saying that, yeah, it's possible Hitler could have escaped. So you have, a lot of people coming forward with this story saying it's a possibility. The only person who, believed the Hitler escape, the Hitler death story, were the British and Hugh Trevor Roper. I mean, everybody else was, for them, the jury was still out.
Wow. Well, I wanted to get into the art treasures. What part did art play in the Ratline? And was the Red Cross involved in it?
Well, there's two questions. The Red Cross was definitely involved in the Ratline. The Red Cross was providing the passports, basically, for the war criminals. So the International Red Cross organization was very much involved in the Ratline. This is how it worked. The part of the Ratline that we're talking about was run by the Vatican. Basically, it was called the monastery route for that reason.
Yeah.
So there were very many high-ranking Catholic clergy, up to cardinal level, who were involved in helping these people escape for their own political agenda, right? So, and maybe for a philosophical agenda as well. So they were helping these people escape, and they were providing false identification for these people in whatever names you wanted. They gave you the paperwork. You could say you were born, wherever you wanted to say, whenever you wanted to say, whatever your name was, whatever that was, you got the paperwork that fit that. Or they would choose, a name and date of birth and everything for you. Mm-hmm. And with that, you would get an International Red Cross passport, which allowed you to get on the boat in Genoa and, go to Latin America. So the collusion between the Vatican and the Red Cross and the Ratline is well known, very well documented. There's photographs of some of these passports. Josef Mengele's passport and papers are photographed there. You can find them on the internet in various places. So there's no doubt about that. The art aspect of it comes down to this. Art was money. Art was a kind of currency.
Yeah.
The Germans knew only too well how a paper currency could be devalued and be devalued very quickly. We have those photographs of Germany in the 1920s with the Deutschmark being so devalued that you would have to take a wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks, of paper German money, just to buy a loaf of bread.
Yes.
So you would wheel this down the street and try to buy a loaf of bread with all that money. And people would often steal the wheelbarrow and leave the money. And that's how serious that problem was. So the Germans knew all too well how you could manipulate currency and how currency could become worthless. I mean, the Germans were deliberately attempting to do that. They were trying to devalue the British pound, for instance, by counterfeiting the British pound, by counterfeiting other currencies. Their plan was to flood the market with foreign currency, counterfeit foreign currency, and devalue those foreign currencies. Their first target was the British pound, but the American dollar was on their list as well. And the guy involved in that, Freddie Schwend, who was sort of the counterfeiting mastermind and an SS officer, also managed to use the Ratline, flee to Latin America, and died mysteriously there. So there's this idea that the Germans had, the Nazis had, that currency was in the end worthless. You needed gold, and you needed tangible things of value. So you needed, the art treasures were extremely important. So the Nazis went through like crazy, not just in Germany, where they confiscated as much art as they could from the Jews and from other people they had thrown into the camps, but then they went into the occupied territories and took, again, from the Jews, but also from art museums, private collections, whatever they could find. Goering, the air marshal, was notorious for his love of, art treasures.
Yeah.
And so people would go through and just steal everything, and all of this wound up in the Nazi bunkers that were being set up in Salzburg, again, in Austria, around Salzburg, in the salt mines. All of this art was being deposited there and hidden in other places, such as in Nuremberg and other places where there were caves, natural caves or mine shafts. This art would be stored there, and that art then would become the the collateral for the Ratline later. Some of it would be found again. Of course, General Patton famously found a lot of art being stored in Salzburg in the salt mines, and recovered a lot of it. The Spear of Destiny, the famous spear that supposedly pierced the side of Christ, that was taken from from the museum in Vienna, the historical museum of Vienna, was recovered. All the crown jewels that had been taken out of Vienna was recovered and returned to Vienna. So you had, a lot of traffic in the art, but there was another aspect to it, and this was some of the art treasures that were found had not just artistic value, but they were valuable historically as archaeological treasures.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you have the German Archaeological Institute actually involved in the Ratline and in helping to finance it as well. And this is a little-known aspect of the Ratline that only came out during my investigations. This has never been really discussed before because no one knew about it. And I only came across it in the diary of this man, this European man who died in Indonesia. He left a diary behind that was written in German, in which he mentions the address, just the address, not the name, the address in Rome of what turned out to be the German Archaeological Institute. It took a lot of digging to find out what this address referred to in Rome. But then I did find it, and I was shocked to see that it was the German Archaeological Institute, and it's specifically mentioned as one of the legs of the Ratline. And with that, it became clear because the German Archaeological Institute was also being investigated by the American intelligence services because they believed that that institute was being used to launder the art objects. Mm-hmm. So things that had been stolen would then be sent to the institute, or notice of it would be sent to the officers of the institute, some of the officers, and these gentlemen would then find markets for it, sell them on the open market, sell them on the black market, raise the money, and this money would then go to help facilitate the Ratline. So this was one of the avenues that was being used, to move the art abroad, to sell it. And of course, the Germans also sold enormous amounts of gold, enormous quantities of gold bars. These are being shipped to Spain in the months just before the end of the war. So a lot of gold wound up in Spain. But the reason it was winding up in Spain was that it was being transshipped out of Spain to locations around the world for safekeeping. So some of this gold wound up in Latin America, and a lot of it wound up in Asia, in Southeast Asia. Submarines were being sent to Southeast Asia with shipments of gold, of all sorts of other important raw materials, documentation on German special projects, scientific projects, things related to the atomic bomb, things relating to the V-1, V-2 rocket programs. This was being sent to the Japanese in the months at the end of the war. A lot of gold that the Japanese had stolen and the Germans had stolen would wind up being buried or hidden in various places in Southeast Asia for the Ratline to use later. So the art objects was an integral part, you could say, of financing the Ratline. And the man who knew where all of that was buried, and the man who was facilitating that, was Otto Skorzeny, and his assistant or his colleague or partner, Hans Rudel. These were both men who were pilots. They were commandos. They were people who were very popular with Adolf Hitler, who worshipped Adolf Hitler. And these guys then wound up in charge of the money, in charge of the financing for the Ratline, and using their influence in any way to help support the neo-Nazi, the post-war Nazi efforts to reconstitute the party, and especially to reconstitute the SS, which was considered the most loyal and the bravest of the Nazi institutions. So this was, the tip of the lance, the tip of the arrow, or the tip of the sword was the SS for the rebirth of the Nazi party, for the Fourth Reich, you might say.
Yeah. Oh boy. They also stole a lot of artworks from the Netherlands too, didn't they?
Oh, from everywhere. From Belgium, from the Netherlands, from Hungary, from Austria, of course, which they annexed, from France. I mean, from all over Europe. You know, they were stealing art everywhere they could find it. I mean, they had standing orders to do this. If they came across a museum, they gutted it, you know, put everything in boxes and shipped it back to the Reich. So this was standard operating procedure.
And
you know, as
Hitler,
far east as they went. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, as far east as they could go. I mean, when they went east into Russia, whatever they found along the way got put up in boxes and sent back. And it wasn't just art treasures. It would be, they would raid, for instance, Masonic temples, right, and steal that stuff as well for use by the SS because they were, you know, trying to catalog members of the Masonic organizations. The regular Freemasons, irregular groups didn't matter. And those names would go into the database because these were people that would be arrested later because they were members of the Masons, which was a proscribed organization. The Nazis saw the Masons and the Jews as being essentially operating together to form these secret societies to take over the world, which is a very popular story these days, you know, among certain people with political agendas. They want to say there's a Masonic Jewish conspiracy. The Nazis believed that, and they were arresting Masons as well as Jews. If you were a high-ranking Mason, you wound up in the concentration camps as well.
Yes. And Hitler had a abnormal obsession over that spear of destiny, didn't he?
Well, I think there are photographs showing Hitler admiring the spear when after Austria had become part of Germany after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. One of the first things that the Nazis did was go to Vienna to the museum and confiscate a lot of the stuff that was in the museum, which is pretty funny if you think that, well, Austria is now part of Germany. Why would you need to confiscate art from your own country and put it someplace else in your own country, right? Obviously, Hitler either didn't trust the Austrians or he really did want to have really close and personal access to some of that material. And the Spear of Destiny, the so-called Spear of Destiny, the lance of Longinus, the lance that supposedly pierced the side of Christ, was a very potent symbol, a potent religious symbol, but also a potent occult symbol, you could say. If that spear did have the blood of Christ on it, and it actually had come in contact with the body of Jesus, now Hitler had access to the actual spear. So it's only one degree of separation then between Hitler and Jesus from his point of view. So the idea that this was a potent occult symbol, a potent magical weapon, I think was not just common to Hitler, but common to a lot of people. I think a lot of people felt that way about the spear. They felt that it had this tremendous power, this innate power that if you had it, you could control events in the real world. You know, and I think Hitler saw it that way. Not just Hitler, Himmler, and a lot of the Nazi high command would have thought that way about the spear. Whether or not they were superstitious about it or not, they could realize its symbolic potential. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had a full-scale model of that spear on his desk in his office.
My goodness.
So that's how deeply they identified with that spear. In fact, Wewelsburg Castle that Himmler was using as his headquarters for the more mystical end of the SS, the plans that had been drawn up by an architect for the complex that would be built around Wewelsburg shows that it was built in the shape of a spear. So there was this real identification with the Nazi agenda and the spear of destiny.
Well, I've heard and read somewhere, Peter, that the spear was shipped to America around the time that we produced the atomic bomb.
That's a story that doesn't go away. I was interviewed for this on Brad Meltzer's Decoded about a year ago. You'll see it every once in a while in reruns on History Channel or Discovery or someplace. And the story is that it was shipped in a submarine, in a Nazi U-boat. And this is the thing. We don't really know as much about the U-boat traffic as we think we know. There's at least one U-boat that has not been recovered off the eastern seaboard of the United States. That's been sitting there and it's really difficult to get to. There's another series of U-boats that had gone missing. They'd gone walkabout basically for months after the war that finally literally surfaced in Argentina. So you have U-boats that were on mysterious errands, running around the Atlantic Ocean and as far as Southeast Asia, as I point out in Ratlines, that were on mysterious missions, that were carrying all sorts of cargo, that were outfitted to carry cargo specifically. So we have this persistent story that one of the U-boats made it as far as Argentina, surfaced at one point secretly off the coast of Argentina, offloaded people and offloaded crates of material, and then wound up in Rio de Plata outside of Buenos Aires and surrendered months after the end of the war. Months. So we have a U-boat that was actually in the water, I think until July or August, when the war ended in April. So you have, or in May officially, so you have the U-boats still floating around out there for months after the end of the war on missions. What was that U-boat doing? Where were they going? Where did they surface? What did they do? So, and the only evidence we have for their activities are the words of the Germans themselves, which, as I point out in Ratline, was not particularly credible as as evidence for anything. Yeah. I mean, they were willing to lie. So this is the story. You have a guy called Admiral Canaris. Canaris was a U-boat captain during World War I. He then became head of the Navy in World War II, and then later became, very influential in the Third Reich until, of course, he was arrested for alleged espionage activities. And then you had more Nazis involved in this, and Canaris knew that there were U-boat bases in Spain that were being used. It was an organization called Etappendienst, and what it was used for was to outfit the U-boats for their missions in the Atlantic Ocean, and that had started in World War I. It was this network of bases in Spain that was used in the north of Spain that was used to outfit German U-boats in World War I and then Nazi U-boats in World War II. So you had this underground network that had already been set up to facilitate all of this. And then you had the rumors, very persistent rumors, during the war and after the war, that the U-boat service would be used to help preserve the cream of the crop of the Nazi Party should the war go against them, or should the whole world turn against Nazi Germany. The U-boat service was prepared to spirit Hitler out of Germany and to spirit as much Nazi wealth as possible out of Germany, so that Germany would not go down the tubes, and that the Nazi Party would continue to exist long after the war. And these were statements made by high-ranking Nazi officers during the war and after the war. So you had, you had a basis for people to believe that there was Nazi U-boat traffic into South America, that Hitler might have escaped, that the Spear of Destiny, left Germany. I mean, we know that Himmler, as I said, had an absolute copy of the Spear of Destiny made sitting on his desk.
Yes.
What if that spear in Vienna today is the copy and not the real spear?
Yeah.
What if the one sitting there was the one that Himmler had made, or other duplicates that had been made?
Well,
the Nazis were famous for counterfeiting.
Yeah, but there was supposed to be a slight difference in the nails that were used in the spear. Right.
That's what I've heard, and there's been one book on it, and the title is escaping me. I think it was called the Holy Reich. But at any rate, it's one of the best books on the subject. Details, the background to the Spear of Destiny, but also the other valuables that have been taken out, and has interviews with some of the people who were involved. So the stories are gradually coming out, 60, 70 years after the end of the war. We're starting to hear what really happened. And the stories are very suggestive that there was a deliberate attempt by people in the Nazi Party to preserve some of these artifacts for their own use later. If the Spear of Destiny were to show up, the real spear, the one that was taken from Vienna, was to show up in the hands of a neo-Nazi organization in Argentina, or somewhere else in the world, or in Syria, or Egypt or Iran or something, the propaganda value of that would be enormous.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, forget what's happening, these days about that famous anti-Muslim film, which has got everybody bothered. I mean, if the Arabs, as an example, wind up, and I say the Arabs generically, whether they're Muslim, Christian, or whatever, if the Arabs, some Arab group winds up with the spear of destiny in its possession and can prove that was the one in Vienna, holy hell is going to break loose. I mean, there's going to be all sorts of repercussions where that's concerned. So you can just imagine the propaganda value of that today would be enormous. So the value of it in those days was very big. So the Nazis would have taken steps, I believe, to hide it, to preserve it. And what best place could there be than the continent that was so pro-Catholic and pro-Nazi at the same time, the South American continent. I mean, you had Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, countries that had been very reluctant and very slow to declare war on Germany until the very end. Yeah. Countries that had large Nazi parties and large Nazi sympathies during the war. What better place to hide a Catholic artifact that the Nazis had stolen than someplace in Latin America?
Wow. Oh, my goodness. Well, we know that the Vatican sequestered some of this stolen art. Peter, is it possible that they are still in possession of some of these artworks?
Oh, there's no doubt. All of the artwork has not been recovered.
Yes.
There's a lot of art. In fact, stuff still shows up from time to time that, had been in Nazi, possession during the war and was believed lost. So you will get paintings, sculptures, things like that, books that will suddenly surface, 60, 70 years later, that no one knew where it had been all that time. People thought it had been lost in the war, that it had been destroyed in a bombing or something, and suddenly these pieces will surface. And why are they surfacing? It's because they had been used, they had been sold into private collections illegally. People who didn't care about the provenance, people who didn't care where the stuff had come from, bought it, resold it, bought it and resold it, and eventually somebody sells it on the open market to raise some cash. Especially with the economic crisis affecting the West, you're going to see more of these artworks potentially surface. And, they're an indication, they're sort of the litmus test or the trace chemical, for finding out, where the rat line extended. Because if you can take that artwork and back trace it as to who owned it and who bought it from whom, you will find it goes right back to the rat line.
Yeah.
So the stuff will be surfacing and will still surface. Paintings that were believed lost are still surfacing, to this day.
Wow.
And that's because the stuff had wound up in the rat line, had changed hands several times, and now it was showing up again in Europe, in Latin America, even in Asia. You're going to find pieces suddenly coming to light in Hong Kong. So, this is an indication that there's a lot more out there to be found. We didn't find everything. Patton found a lot. But he didn't find everything. He found, basically what was easy to find. He had informants in those villages around the salt mines who were collaborating with the Allies when they came in. And they were saying, I was, working in the mines and, all of these trucks showed up and we started moving crates, into the salt mines, into these locations. But that, that villager, that farmer, saw some of it and knew where some of it was buried. But there were other people who saw where other cartloads and truckloads of stuff, was buried, and they never spoke. They never talked. So I think you're going to find that there's a lot more, probably even some still buried near Salzburg. Well, there was the belief, very common among the Nazis, among the Allies and the Nazis, that there was going to be this kind of underground fortress that the Nazis were building in Austria near Salzburg. That was going to be their last-ditch stand. They were putting food, ammunition, and thousands of soldiers were going to be hiding out, in this underground city, waiting for their chance to come out and attack the Allies from the rear, basically. And this was a story that, the Allies eventually tried to dismiss as a fantasy. But Hitler's favorite pilot, Hanna Reich, a very devoted Nazi, a woman who was one of the last people to see Hitler in the bunker in Berlin in April of 1945, one of the last people there, one of the last people to fly out of Germany successfully, to fly out of Berlin rather, and make her way to Austria, was later captured by the Allies. And her testimony was that that underground facility did exist, and that people in Berlin at the bunker were discussing the feasibility of getting there. You know, was it 100% ready yet? And the scuttlebutt, you know, around the bunker was that it was, you know, 50% or 60% or 70% complete, that it was not totally complete yet, but that it might be usable. And she told us to the Allies. I mean, she believed in it, and the people in the bunker believed in it. It wasn't a fantasy to them, it was a reality. And they had kind of detailed knowledge as to the degree of completion of this underground system of mines and facilities. I mean, they had electrical power down there. They had everything they needed for months to withstand, you know, an Allied onslaught, and then to come out fighting. So something that vast, something that large, we haven't found it. We found some of the salt mines. We found some of the artworks that were buried. But because the Allies decided that this underground fortress was a fantasy of the Nazis, they never really looked for it that seriously.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, they kind of gave up, you know, on it, and they said, nah, you know, it was a Nazi fantasy. It was one of Hitler's, you know, dreams that, you know, just like his so-called secret weapons were fantasies, which we now know were not. Why should we disbelieve, you know, the stories about the National Redoubt, as it was called, this underground fortress near Salzburg? Maybe it did exist. Maybe the Nazis, you know, were not living in there and doing what they said they were going to do. But what did they store in that fortress? You know, they stored things that they would need later, not just food and ammunition. They stored money. They stored gold. They stored what they would need to continue their operations. So I believe that there's a lot that we still haven't found. And, you know, 70 years after the end of the war sounds like a long time, but it's not really. You know, that, you know, as I say, artwork is still surfacing today. So, you know, it's possible that there's going to be more that's going to be discovered, and if there's more stories. I mean, there's a lot happening in Asia, where Japanese gold buried in the Philippines keeps surfacing every 10, 15 years or so. There's another discovery of stuff that was buried at the end of the war. We're going to keep finding this stuff out for decades to come.
Wow. Well, what about why were the SS officers, the Ustashi, and the Latin American fascist Catholic prelates convinced that a third world war was at hand, and thereby they could create a Fourth Reich? Well,
the Soviet Union was the key issue here. The Nazis sincerely believed that if the West would just come to its senses, they would realize the Soviet Union was the enemy and not them. This was their narrative. This is what they believed. So their belief was very strong. I mean, Hitler could not understand, really, why the West had turned against him and not against the Soviet Union. Because in his mind, you know, the Bolsheviks were the curse, were the enemy. They were atheists, godless communists, you know. From his point of view, the whole world should rise up against them. So the very cynical appreciation of the Nazis of the situation was that once the West came to its senses, once it had defused the quote-unquote Nazi problem, they would then turn their guns immediately on the Soviet Union, and the Germans would be the ones to make out when that happened, because they would be sitting on the sidelines. They'd be waiting for the Allies and the Soviet Union to demolish each other, and then the Nazis would then be reborn like a phoenix from the ashes of that Third World War, because they'd be forced to sit it out, basically, because they were in prison or they were in hiding around the world. They would sit and wait while the Cold War turned into a hot war and the two sides wiped each other out, or were so weakened by the conflict that they would not be able to resist a new Nazi offensive. So they were convinced of this. They thought that it just took the Americans very little time to understand the Soviet Union was their enemy. And let's face it, by 1947, the Cold War had already started. And in 1947, the Nazis were still using the Ratlines. They were still escaping. They were escaping as late as the early 1950s. That Ratline was in operation out of Salzburg that long.
Oh, my gosh.
Easily 8 to 10 years after the end of the war. The Ratline was still functioning. Papers were still being generated. Nazis were still escaping. I mean, Klaus Barbie being one of the last ones to get out, I think as late as 1950. So you had this process going on as the Cold War had started, as the Iron Curtain had come down. Patton, had famously said that they were pointing their guns in the wrong direction. He was, agitating Truman for permission to take his army into Russia.
Yeah.
He wanted a shooting war with the Russians. He was ready to go. So the Nazis believed with this atmosphere taking place, with this intense, drama that was unfolding between the Americans and the British on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other, that they had it made in the shade, that eventually, people would come to their senses. And what happened? We had the CIA, which was formed in 1947, deliberately go out and recruit the Gehlen organization, all of these Nazi intelligence people who had worked for Hitler, who had been spying on the Soviet Union, were now being embraced by the American intelligence community.
They still are.
And still are.
Yeah.
We had Dragonovich, the Eustachi priest, this Monsignor who had created the monastery route. He was now a CIA agent. He was now working for the CIA, and this is documented. This is, these documents have been declassified. You can read them. So he was being employed. We had Paperclip, in which we were bringing all these Nazi scientists to the United States. So what message were we sending to the Nazis?
Yeah.
The message we were sending is, we need your help against the Russians.
Yeah.
They were being used in the Middle East. They were being used to prop up Nasser's regime. They were used to prop up Assad's, people. I mean, there was a tremendous presence of the Nazis in all of these danger places around the world where communism was trying to get an inroad, particularly in Latin America, where there was a growth now of communism, of sort of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro style communism. Marxism, Leninism was now on the rise in Latin America, and what better bulwark against that than former Nazis, right? So you had this Nazi underground in Latin America designed to fight communism, just the way they had been fighting communism in Europe. They used the same techniques in Latin America. So basically, they had not stopped fighting their war. The Nazis continued to fight their war long after the end of the official end of World War II. The Nazis were still fighting it.
Oh my gosh.
And they continue to fight it. And, there's a whole new group of neo-Nazis, which I don't call neo-Nazis because they're not neos, they're still Nazis.
Yeah.
Still fighting the war. So that hasn't stopped. I mean, if we take this macro political look at it, if we step back a little bit from the minutiae of the details, and we look at the global picture the way the Nazis did and still do, you can see the perspective. The perspective is, we, the Nazis, are still fighting the war that you were afraid to fight, in the beginning as a hot war. We're fighting as a hot war. We're fighting it in Latin America. We were fighting it against the communists there. We were fighting it in Asia. We're fighting it in the Middle East. We know who the enemy is, even if you're too stupid to know, and we're going to continue this fight. We have the funds, to do it. We have the will to do it. Plus, from time to time, we have your okay to do it. We have your cooperation or collaboration to do it. So the Nazi agenda went on. It did not end. We should not be confused too much by peace treaties, and the Nuremberg trials and all of that. We have to really look at the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is a lot of Nazis escaped. They didn't go into, a tender kind of retirement and become gentlemen farmers somewhere. They did get involved politically, and as far as they were able to do, they did. And Israel, after the Eichmann affair, Israel pretty much gave up on hunting down Nazis. They saw that politically it wasn't doing them any good either. And in fact, Walter Rauff, the guy who invented the mobile gas van, actually worked for Mossad for a short period of time.
Oh,
he was in their employ.
I want to ask a question, and you're leading into some other things that I want to talk about. But I want to back up here a minute and ask you about New Zealand and Nazis. Were any of them escaping to New Zealand?
Absolutely. In fact, you have war criminals today in Australia that are fighting extradition, that are fighting war crimes charges, and in New Zealand, you've got people down as far away as Australia and New Zealand, which is why when I wrote Ratlines, my point is that why wouldn't they be in Indonesia when we know they wound up in Australia and New Zealand, which is a bit further away from Europe than Indonesia. So, sure. I mean, they did make it that far.
Are they still active in New Zealand?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, the ones that escaped are quite old at this point. I think they were active once, they felt secure enough to be active. I mean, famously, Mel Gibson's father in Australia was somehow, involved with one of these guys, according to the stories.
Yeah.
Again, we have some people who are very Roman Catholic and who found no problem in cooperating with people who had been Nazis. It's another story, I guess. But, you had people who, by their very presence and by the fact that they were in hiding for crimes they had committed, were people who would gather around themselves a network of like-minded people. My understanding of how the Ratline worked was that you didn't go to a foreign country unless there was a support system already in place there.
Yes.
Argentina was the perfect example. I mean, you were met at the boat. When you got off the boat in Buenos Aires, you were met, by the Nazi underground, who would then find you a place to live and find you a job and get you integrated into society as best as they could, depending upon your rank. If you were a lowly person escaping, you might not get as much attention as if you were a high-ranking officer, but still, there was a network, there was an underground to help you. And that was true in the Middle East. It was true in Latin America. Why would it not have been true in Australia and New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
If you wound up there, it's because there was somebody there waiting to help you, which is why my Indonesian story is important, because there was a large Nazi party in evidence in Indonesia in the years before the war and during the war. So there was an underground that was ready to assist Nazis who were coming into that country. So there would have been an underground. I think that's more important than the actual war criminal himself. He's basically just the way to trace the rest of the network.
Yeah.
So if you look for the war criminal, you've got to look for the people he met when he landed.
Yeah.
The people he met, the people who helped him find a job, the people who helped him hide with fake identities and all the rest of it. These are the people we need to find, because these are the people who were there in the beginning, who were forming this fifth column within the Allied societies. And we have a lot of documentation on some of these people and some of these guys, and we stopped looking after the end of the war. I mean, we stopped this aggressive search for war criminals because it became politically unsaleable. The communists were now our enemies, not the Nazis. Stop looking for Nazis, which is exactly what our people were told in Salzburg in the 1940s. They were told to hunt them down to be arrested, and then suddenly the narrative changed, and they were being told to hunt them down to recruit them. So the whole thing changed, which is why this myth of Nazi hunters it is a myth. I mean, there are Nazi hunters who are very committed people. Like the Klarsfelds, for instance, and the Simon Wiesenthal people to a certain extent. Even the Wiesenthal people gave up in certain critical areas and did not pursue the Nazis when they could, because basically Israel said, let's keep a low profile on this because we don't want to ruin our relationships with foreign countries over this issue. So we need all the help we can get on the international stage. So, we have other enemies. Let's calm down. And, we have the Arabs now. That's a whole other issue. The Nazis can help us there. So everything changed. It's real politics, right? And everything changed because of that. So we stopped looking. That's a very important thing to remember. There was no concerted effort to hunt down Nazis after about 1947, 48 or so, when the Cold War started. The whole idea of hunting Nazis became kind of lukewarm.
Yeah.
The Eichmann case was an aberration in 1960 when Israeli Secret Service went after Adolph Eichmann and kidnapped him, brought him out of Argentina to stand trial. That was an aberration, and that was it. I mean, Klaus Barbie by that time it was okay in the 1980s. You could arrest a Klaus Barbie who had been sitting there pretty much in full view, for 30 years after the end of the war. So they kind of had to arrest him and extradite him. But a concerted effort to use resources that were better used against the Arabs, no, that was not going to happen. If a Nazi happened to show up, sure, they would go and try to file papers to have him extradited. But to deliberately go in and to do the dirty work and to hunt him down, no. That's why Mengele escaped. That's why Walter Rauff lived to a ripe old age in Chile. So many people escaped and were visible. Priepke is still visible in South America for years. He was being interviewed by, Sam Donaldson. This kind of stuff went on and nobody cared.
Yeah.
And so the stories that we were told and the stories that we know, we've been told since childhood about, the evil Nazis and how they were hunted down and how the war criminals were sought and, the whole Eichmann story is kind of a smokescreen for what really happened. What really happened was we may need these guys on our side. The Israelis needed them to fight the Arabs, to get intelligence against the Arabs, which is pretty funny because the Nazis were working with the Arabs, but that's another story. So you had that going on one side. You had, the Allies using the Nazis for scientific reasons, for intelligence reasons, and for, assassination, wet work against communists in Latin America and in Europe. The Operation Condor in South America, was heavily, was a Nazi organization, was a Nazi operation. So, why, at what point were we still hunting Nazis? We weren't. So somebody like Hitler could have escaped as easily as Klaus Barbie did, as easily as Klaus Barbie, as Walter Rauff, as Josef Mengele, as all of these guys escaped. They all escaped. They all managed to get out and live to ripe old ages. So why not a Hitler? And why not a Martin Bormann for that matter?
Yeah.
What real evidence do we have that Bormann lived and died in Berlin? In April of 1945. We have a skull that was found, that was forensically proven to be Bormann's, found in Berlin, which was coated with red clay. And this particular kind of red clay is found nowhere in Berlin, but it is found, in Paraguay. So, my feeling is Bormann died in Latin America, and parts of his body were brought and then reburied in Berlin to, call off the dogs. So this would not surprise me, So, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a global cover-up.
Yes.
Of the Nazis, particularly the SS, but the Nazis in general, a global cover-up of people who could be of value to the other governments after the war, for whatever reason, for whatever purpose. The church would have been equally as complicit in this because of the stance of the Nazis regarding communism.
Yeah.
So, everybody had a reason to cooperate with the Nazis. Everybody did.
Wow. Let's shift to the Middle East. What is the difference between Islam and Muslim?
Well, Islam is the name of the religion, and the word Muslim derives from the word Islam. And a Muslim is one who has surrendered to the faith. So Islam is the faith of surrendering to God, and a Muslim is one who has surrendered.
Well, my understanding was that Islam had more to do with the political end, and Muslim had to do more with the religious part of it. I could be wrong.
I don't think that's true. I mean, Islam is of course the religion that was created or discovered, revealed by the Prophet Muhammad back in the 7th century, and it was called Islam. The problem that we have in the West of understanding this was the fact that it began pretty much with warfare.
Yes.
So the Prophet was not accepted by a lot of people in Saudi Arabia, where he was born, where he was raised. His own tribe, the Quraysh, were pretty much against him, and they were the ones running the Kaaba in Mecca, the black stone which is worshipped. It was a pagan shrine at first.
Yeah.
So he took that over by force. He was forced out of Mecca. He went to Medina, then Medina back to Mecca, took over the shrine. This is when we sort of date the beginning of Islam to that that back and forth between Mecca and Medina. And then, of course, they sort of went on the warpath, and converted by persuasion or by force the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, and then went on to other parts, into Iraq, into what is now Iraq and Iran and the Levant. So it's hard for Westerners to separate the religion from the military operation and the political operation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of confusion over the Islamic perception about the relationship between politics and religion. To a fundamentalist, there can be no division between government and religion. The caliphs, the successors to the prophet, were political leaders as well as religious leaders.
Yes.
So they did share power, with military people and stuff like that. But the caliph was kind of a supreme leader, like a sultan is a kind of a king, but only in Islamic terms. So a sultan is a Muslim who is a political ruler. So there is this confusion of roles. I mean, for us, it's a confusion of roles. To a Muslim, it's clear.
Yeah.
But we had this. Remember, we had this in Europe with Christianity. We had this with, the Pope crowning Charlemagne, as the Holy Roman Emperor. So we have this idea of church and state having been united. So to somebody on the outside looking in, the Catholic Church was a political organization and a military organization, not just a religion, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were a pagan living in Europe and the church came into town with swords and with laws and with government as well as with churches. So you would be excused if you made that, confusion between church and state, because it was the same for a long time, at least in the eyes of the people who were suffering because of it.
Yeah.
Maybe legalistically, it wasn't the same at all, and you could draw a clear line to demarcation. The Inquisition, for instance, the office of the Inquisition was religious, but the people who carried out the Inquisition were secular rulers, So you can kind of say, well, the Inquisition, the horrors of the Inquisition were really carried out by secular authorities in many cases. But, that's just being weaselly about it. I mean, it wasn't a religious thing. So, no, this idea that Islam refers to a political group and Muslims are the religion, no. A Muslim is a person who is a member of Islam, who's a follower of Islam, who has accepted Islam as the religion. It may be that in some countries there's an attempt to make Islam the political state, to make a Sharia law, for instance, which everybody talks about, but which has never fully been implemented, I don't think, anywhere. If Sharia law is a secular thing from our perspective, then you can say that's an indication of how church and state has become mixed in Islam, where Islam becomes a political
Morsi,
thing.
The leader of Egypt now, has said that he wants Sharia law. Sure.
People say that to mollify the activists, to mollify the fundamentalists. As a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, he kind of has to say that, this is what he wants. He has to make those statements. But, you can want a lot of things and not really work very hard to achieve them. And I don't think that Egypt anytime soon is going to go under Sharia law. It's just not going to happen. I mean, the whole point of creating that democracy and ousting Mubarak was to give the people a greater voice in their government, to end repression, to end corruption in government and all of that. That was the whole point of the Arab Spring in general, I think, is to get rid of the dictators. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's anti-Islamic. It may be very Islamic to get rid of the dictators. The Arab Spring may be a resurgence of Islamic piety in the areas, as it was in many parts of the world when dictators were ousted. There's a resurgence of religious feeling and religious ideas. But, the Egyptians don't want to be Saudis, And even in Saudi Arabia, we do not believe that Sharia law has been fully implemented. That was one of the arguments that Osama bin Laden had against the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, was that they did not fully implement Sharia law. They only seem to, but they don't really.
Peter, explain to the audience exactly what Wahhabism is.
Well, it was a religious movement that began as a kind of a reaction against what the founder of the Wahhabi founder saw as the decadence that was taking place in the weakness of the Arab people. It's kind of misleading to talk about Islam in a general way. Islam is not monolithic. It's not one thing. It's like talking about Christianity. Well, you're talking about Lutherans or Catholics or Baptists or Southern Baptists or Presbyterians or High Church Anglican or Low Church Anglican, right? You have a lot of different colors in Christianity. The same thing is true with Islam. What the Wahhabis objected to was the weakness of the Arab world. I mean, they didn't really have much knowledge of the Muslims living in Asia, for instance. They were not really that deeply in contact with them or understood much what was going on there. But their direct evidence was what was happening with the Arab world. And remember, the Arab world for 500 or plus years was under the domination of the Turks, of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
The Ottoman Empire itself was very corrupt. It was secular. It was a sort of degenerated kind of kingdom from the point of view of the diehard Arabs and Muslims. So they saw the Turks as an invading force that was not purely Islamic. So the leaders of the Wahhabis and Qutb and all the people who were contributing to the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, these were people who saw that the Arab world had become weak, and they believed that the weakness of the Arab world was due to their lack of piety, their lack of adherence to religious beliefs. They saw that they had lost their faith, basically. And the weakness they interpreted was in relation to the former glory of Islam. Remember, at one point, Islam, or armies under Islamic rule, had occupied not only all of North Africa, the Middle East, but they had also taken huge chunks of Europe.
Yes.
They owned Portugal, what is now Portugal and Spain, until 1492, until the year Columbus left on his voyage of exploration. I mean, that was the year the last caliph was ousted from Granada in Spain. So they had this large hegemony over large portions of Europe. That was in the west, and in the east it was in the Balkans. There were Ottomans then later going as far as Vienna, taking over vast amounts of territory. So you had Muslim armies everywhere. So there was a glory period. And then suddenly around the 15th, 16th century, all of that disappeared. All of that went away. The Ottoman Turks took whatever they could, and the era of this glorious period of the caliphates disappeared. So now you have people who want to see the caliphates restored. A caliph is an Arab term, but it means the successor to the prophet.
Yeah.
So they want to restore that which they used to glory in the old days, where you had Islamic rulers over all of Muslim territory. Wherever there were Muslims, there were Islamic rulers. So you had them all over North Africa, the Middle East, including Israel, of course, what is today Israel. That was all Muslim territory. And then you had Muslim rulers in Spain and in Portugal and in the Balkans, in what is the former Yugoslavia. So you had huge presence there, a powerful presence, and this was lost. Somehow this went down the tubes, and the Arabs became weak. They became impoverished. They lacked political power. They lacked unity. In particular, there was no unity among the various tribes. All the things that the prophet had worked to pull together had disappeared. And now these people were, in the 19th century, the 20th century, were saying, okay, it's time to be great again. It's time to recapture that former glory. And the only way to do that is with a common belief system, with a common ideology. And that common ideology is Islam, is our particular interpretation of Islam, Wahhabism, which is a fundamentalist kind of extreme form based on selective reading of the Quran, based on selective readings of the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and incorporating them into their own particular worldview. The thing about Islam is there's no pope. There is no one central authority that says, this is how you must behave. This is the law, this is not the law. There are groups of people who can offer their opinions. There are special scholars that everybody reveres. But there's no pope. So you can have a Muslim with a completely different understanding of the Quran than another Muslim. And this is something that we in the West have to understand too. There's no pope. There's no unified Islamic church. Islam is a general sort of generic term for a lot of people who are followers of the Prophet and followers of the Quran. So these people share some things in common. They may believe that, you have to pray 5 times a day, you have to fast during Ramadan, you have to give 10% of your income to the poor. All of these things are part of what you're supposed to do to be a Muslim. But outside of that, there's a lot of leeway.
Oh, yeah.
So you have a lot of different versions, a lot of different flavors of Islam, some of which are extremely pro-Arab in their complexion. Their Arab culture is kind of fetishized to the point where you have to be as Arab as possible to be a true Muslim. And then on the other side, you have people who believe that their ethnic identities are equally as important and that their interpretation of Islam is just as valid as an Arab's. So you have a lot of diversity there. Islam is really built for that because there is so much internal argument over what is genuine, what is true. And then you have people like the Assad, in Syria, which is the focal point of all of the angst today in the Arab world. And these guys, if you look in their background, they're Notaries and Alawis. These people are not mainstream Muslims by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, typically their belief system is closer to Shia than Sunni, so they're getting kind of some support from Iran. But on the other hand, even then, these are not normative Muslims. I mean, the traditional Alawis and Notaries really don't believe that you have to pray 5 times a day or fast during Ramadan, So even the five pillars of Islam, the things that we call the 5 pillars, are not embraced by his ancestors, by Assad's ancestors. Personally, I don't know what he believes today, but his father was, not particularly Muslim from, a normative point of view, and his ancestors definitely were not. And the Alawis that still exist are sometimes considered Christian, so they're considered Christian by Muslims. So it's a mess, So what's a Muslim? What exactly is a Muslim? It's hard to say, it's hard to say. You have to accept the Quran. You have to accept there's no God, but God, one God, and that Muhammad was his prophet. But past that, it gets a little murky.
Yeah, and if you try to leave Islam, they kill you.
Well, yes. In some cases, that has happened. I mean, there's no hiding it.
Yeah.
Or if they don't try to kill you, they will issue a fatwa against you. You do have some problems, but there have been Muslims who have left. As long as they leave with a very low profile, nobody seems to care.
Yeah.
If you leave with a high profile, though, you're just asking for trouble.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, how was it that the Nazis used the Arabs?
Well, it was easy. It was a match made in heaven, sort of. This is the thing. What we don't realize about the political situation, what we don't see in the West because we're given kind of the 6th grader version of it, is that it's much more complex than we've set it out to be. That's understood in the press. World War I was the end of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. That was the end of the Turkish Empire.
Yes.
Remember Lawrence of Arabia, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing, right? So the Turkish Empire was destroyed with the help of the Arab revolt in Saudi Arabia, which was basically a Wahhabi revolt against the Turks. Again, which we don't really understand. We don't know too much in the West. So there was this revolt against the Turks. The Arabs were promised a lot of things by the British and by the British in particular. They were promised their own homeland. They were promised they would be liberated. They were promised they would have self-rule, autonomy, and all the rest of it. That, we're helping you liberate your country for yourself. Well, that wasn't true.
Yeah,
they were betrayed.
Why is this sound so familiar? Lie.
We've been down this road before.
Yeah.
It's the same sad song. So we lied to them. We brought in the British and the French cut up the region after World War I.
Yeah.
They drew the boundaries. They drew the lines of the countries. They created what is now Iraq. They created what is now Lebanon, Syria, Egypt even. They created what is now Israel.
Yes.
Kuwait. All of this was created at the end of World War I
Afghanistan.
by British intelligence officers, specifically by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and Gertrude Bell, the famous British archaeologist, one of the most famous female archaeologists ever, who had created the Baghdad Museum, who had spent a lot of time among the tribes in what is now Iraq. These two got together with, of course, British intelligence, and they essentially drew the lines of what is now the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there was something called the Balfour Declaration, in which Lord Balfour contracted with the Zionist organizations, that if you, the Jews, help us, to overthrow the Germans and the Turks, we'll give you your own homeland in Palestine. Well, the Arabs are not told about this arrangement. The idea was floated to King Faisal. It was floated to the people in Saudi Arabia, and there was a kind of acceptance. Well, okay, the way you put it, the way you describe it, that could work. We'll have a place for the Jews to live, and that'll be fine, because we already have Jews, in the area, and what's a few more Jews? We'll create a homeland, and that'll be fine. There was a kind of grudging acceptance in the declassified documents that have come to light, but not of the way it was handled, not of the way it actually turned out, because the Arabs thought they were getting all of the territory to themselves. They didn't realize there'd be British spheres of influence and French spheres of influence, and there would be mandates, there would be control of the oil and all the rest of it. Yeah. Basically, they were screwed. Okay, yep. When they woke up at the end of World War I, they did not have total rule over the region. They suddenly found the territories being divided. So there was this tremendous feeling against the Europeans of, we've been betrayed. We've been betrayed by the British, and we've been betrayed by the French. And in that context, you had the growth of this guy, Al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. It's kind of a religious leader in Jerusalem, a person who's very well respected as an Islamic scholar. Suddenly he comes on the scene. He's very in favor of getting rid of the British and French out of the area and creating, their own homeland for the Palestinians and for the people who live in the region. So he becomes a firebrand in the 1920s and 1930s, and he's vociferously against the British and the French. And guess what? In the 1930s, who else hates the British and the French? The Nazis, Adolf Hitler and his people. And to the Nazis, the Arabs are slated for execution anyway, because they're just as Semitic as the Jews. As far as the Nazis are concerned, they can all die.
Yeah.
But in the context of the war, since they hate the Jews so much, and since the Jewish homeland issue has become the rallying point for anti-colonial activity in the Middle East, Al-Husseini and Hitler strike a couple of deals. So we have famous photographs, I think in Ratline you'll see one or two, of Al-Husseini, the leader of this radical faction of Muslims in the Middle East, actually meeting with Hitler and then going on to form a Muslim SS division out of the Muslims who are in Bosnia. Now, the Bosnian Muslims have this narrative that they're not Arabs. They're Muslims, but they are Aryans.
Yeah.
They're not even Slavs. This is very funny, from my perspective. The Croatians put forward this argument that they were not really Slavic people. They were Aryans who wound up in the Balkans in Slavic territories, but they're so alien from the rest that they're actually a different race, that they're Aryans. And the Bosnians were making the same argument. And so the SS sort of said, okay, for now that's fine. We need your help to fight the communists and to fight, to round up the Jews and everything else. So they formed an SS division. And there's pictures of Husseini from Palestine, from Jerusalem, marching, and reviewing the troops, the Bosnian SS Handschar division, the mountain division of the SS. Mm-hmm. So they made common cause because they both wanted to end British and French dominance in the Middle East. Hitler for his reasons and Husseini for his. So you have, they're making common cause. And that common cause remains, especially after partition and especially after the date when Israel was declared as an independent country, as a free state, in which all the Arab countries then immediately attacked it. At that point, the Nazis figured, okay, we're now back in a hot war. We're back in a shooting war.
Yeah.
We can make common cause with the Arabs. We can get them on our side. We'll go and help them. We'll train their people. We'll train their secret police. We'll train their armies. We'll help them develop secret weapons You know, they were involved in a rocket program in Egypt in the 1950s. You know, they were developing rockets to attack Israel. All of this was on the books. All of this was, you know, was being discussed as, you know, as common cause between Arabs and Nazis. There is no particular love of the Nazis for Arabs in general. They're considered to be second-class citizens. They're not really human as far as the Nazis are concerned.
Well, the
but
Jews
they did
too.
Well, they're Jews too, sure. But they did admire Islam. They thought Islam was a more it was a more manly kind of faith. I mean, their diatribes against the Jews, you know, Muhammad's occasional references to the Jews in the context of his war in Saudi Arabia, which has to be pointed out, which usually never is. But all of these things were taken to be evidence that, well, we can trust these guys, you know, for a while. Let's use them, you know, until we don't need them anymore.
Yeah.
Which is how they used the Ukrainian SS division, you know, was to fight Russia. I mean, the Ukrainians were Slavs, and the Ukrainians were scheduled for being enslaved and possibly killed later. But during the war, you know, they had to make hard choices, so they adapted, you know, an entire Ukrainian SS division, an entire Muslim SS division. All of these people were not considered Aryans by the Nazis, but they would still be used in the war effort. And that's why you find common cause between the Arabs and the Nazis. The Arabs should be aware, and the Muslims should be aware in general, that the Nazis had no love for them, that they're only using them, that it's only a marriage of convenience, that as soon as the Nazis have achieved their agenda, they're on the chopping block as well.
Mm-hmm. That's for sure. You know, a lot of people are very worried that this kind of chopping block thing will come to America. What is your view on that, Peter?
Well, the doctrines of Nazism, of fascism and generally, and Nazism in particular, had fertile ground in the United States. I mean, there's the anti-communist thing. We've seen that in some of the rhetoric against the Democratic Party, against progressives, against Obama in particular, the idea that he's a socialist or a communist. I mean, these words still seem to have power among certain demographics, and there are people who identify with being anti-communist and anti-socialist. They may not understand what the words mean. Neither did a lot of Germans, you know, in the 1920s and 1930s. But it didn't matter. This was the enemy. There was a racial association. Communists and socialists in Germany were considered to be Russians, which were Slavs and which were Mongols, or to the German idea. These were uncivilized people. Or they were Jews, right? So, I mean, it was a lose-lose situation there. You know, you were either Jewish or you were a Slav. In either case, you were not German. Well, in the United States, we have some of the same ideas. You know, it was easy to call Obama socialist and communist because he was a different race anyway. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it became easier to do that than to call Clinton a socialist or communist. That never really stuck. You know, Clinton was a good old boy. You know, Clinton was a good old boy from the South, and a Baptist and everything. You know, I mean, Clinton came from their background, so it was hard for people to raise that specter of communism and socialism in a popular way. There was right-wing, you know, diatribes against Clinton for being that, just as there was right-wing diatribes against Eisenhower for being a socialist and a communist. You know, I mean, these things will go on. You'll always find people saying stuff like that, but. Today in the United States, because of our economic situation, which was similar to the economic situation in Germany in the 1920s, because of the depletion of our resources because of war, which was again what happened in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, all of these things can set the stage for the appearance of a forceful, charismatic leader. For somebody to rally the people around a sort of fascist, you know, ideal. So it would be something that would say, okay, we're Christians, we're not communists. It's a Christian country, which again is not true. The founding fathers were notoriously bad Christians. But this is a Christian country. You know, we hate Freemasons, again, stupidly, because many of our founding fathers were Freemasons. And if it wasn't for the Freemasons, there wouldn't have been a United States. Right. But anyway, all these things, let's not bother ourselves with the facts, right? You know, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? You know. So this is the thing, you know. So this is the narrative. You know, we're a Christian country. We hate socialism and communism, whatever that means. This is a country that is being, there's too many immigrants coming in, so our racial, profile is being quote unquote degraded or eroded or polluted by too many foreigners coming in and, basically ruining white Anglo-Saxon culture. So you're going to have this, and it's not going to end anytime soon. It's not going to end, if Obama is reelected or not, it's still not going to end. This is going to be, fertile ground for a leader to come in the future who, as they say, is not going to bring fascism with stormtrooper boots with swastika armbands, but he's going to bring it in a nice Armani suit and a briefcase, and we're going to have it. We're going to have it in a different way. We already have the erosion of civil liberties that's been taking place gradually over the last 20, 30 years, but especially since 9/11. We've had all of these things gradually taking place, legally taking place. The Nuremberg laws were legal. That the Nazis instituted to strip the Jews of citizenship. Mm-hmm. That was legal in the terms of the German, political system, legal system. I mean, things can be done legally which are not ethically or morally defensible.
Right.
And that can continue to happen. And just as Germany had the Jews, we have terrorists. So we have a scapegoat. We have a reason to unite the people. Just as Germany had the Reichstag fire that Hitler used as an excuse to name himself the complete ruler of Germany, we had 9/11. We had that as the excuse. Hitler said it was communists who had started the Reichstag fire, and we said it was, Arab terrorists or Islam in general that started the 9/11 situation.
I doubt that the Arabs had anything to do with the 9/11 incident. It seems to be an inside job. As terrible as that sounds, it just seems to be that way.
Well, I've been criticized for being extremely reluctant to get in on either side of that debate. I think one of the reasons is I'm a New Yorker. I saw the towers going up. I was in the towers as they were being constructed because I knew people who worked there. Mm-hmm. I lived in Brooklyn Heights, so I could look out from the promenade and see the towers going up and see the towers. And for 4 years, every day of my life, I traveled to the towers by subway because I worked in that area. So for me, it's a sort of a visceral thing. And to believe that we did this ourselves, to me, is still something that I have a hard time accepting. Now, the funny thing is I've accepted a lot of other sick stuff over the years. The Ratlines, Nazis escaping, all sorts of other things. I've risked my life in Latin America and other places to find out, what really was going on, to find out the truth, to see what's really happening. I don't mind doing that because I think the truth is more important. But when it comes to this, I always hit this hesitance to come out and say it was an inside job. Because if it was an inside job, if our government or a rogue element, let's say, of our government was in any way responsible for it, then, from my point of view, all hope is lost. I mean, where do you go from there? There's nowhere else to go. There's nowhere else on the planet to go. So, you're kind of stuck with it. Maybe that's what they were counting on, to be cynical about it. But this idea that the extreme right has, the First Amendment, people and the Second Amendment people, that, we have to organize and we have to, buy as many guns as possible, to me is laughable. I mean, it's ridiculous. The government has all the guns, okay? All the guns they would ever need.
Yes.
The government has nuclear weapons, my friend. Your AK-47s that have been modified so they're on full auto, I'm sorry. When it comes to, the military doing whatever that they do, they have the drones, and they have all the rest of it. We don't have a chance militarily. Let's stop that pipe dream, that fantasy of the cowboy, and the Indians. It's just not. It is a fantasy. It just never happened, and it's not going to happen this time. What's going to happen is if taking charge through the process, uncovering the dirt where possible, making sure the people who were responsible for some of these things get outed and get prosecuted. And it's going to be a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight. I don't trust the people who are stockpiling weapons because I wouldn't want to listen to them as political leaders.
Right.
I wouldn't want them in charge of my life, let's face it, because I'd be one of the first people to get sent away. Those FEMA camps they're so worried about, if the guys with the guns take over, if the Tea Party takes over, they're going to put me in the camps. I mean, there's no way out for me. The books that I've written and the things that I've complained about in the past will put me there just as easily as they'll put, any political leader. I'm not a political leader, but because of the things that I've written about and the things I've discussed, especially on the occult aspects of political power and all the rest of it, that's very unchristian,
Yeah.
That's going to get me prosecuted. So from my point of view, the whole thing is very problematic. But I do have problems with the official story of 9/11. Of course I do. I'm a reasonable, rational person. I've looked at the documents. I've listened to the experts. I've watched the film footage, as painful as it is. I do have problems with the 9/11 story as it's been put out by the government. Who could not?
Yeah.
There's just too many holes in that story. I've read the stuff by Hopsicker, on Terrorland USA on what the so-called hijackers were doing in Florida all that time.
Yeah.
Not to mention the other places they were operating, but Florida, my God, what they were doing back and forth, and the pre-knowledge that we must have had
Yes.
of these guys, the pre-knowledge that intelligence had to have had. Why did our Air Force basically stand down, and not do anything where those planes flying all over the place, were concerned? What the hell happened? And why did our president just sit there in Florida, by the way, reading his goat story to the kids, with the look of a frightened deer in the headlights? What the hell was going on? What was wrong with the country? What was that story? I mean, there is a lot more that has to be told. And there's a book coming out. If it's not out already. I've written a foreword to it. And it's a book about 9/11 as basically a ritual, an act of ritual that has taken place.
Wow.
And this guy, S.K. Bain, what he's done is he's gone through and kind of deconstructed the timelines, deconstructed the dates that things happened from an occult perspective, trying to show that this was, there was something mysterious and occult going on, and the destruction of the towers was a ritual designed to bring in some kind of weird new age. So I think that a lot of the new age, new world order people are going to be very interested in this book. And I hope you have him on at some point to discuss it. The book has, I think, just come out maybe this week. I've seen my foreword of it has started to filter through, going around on the internet. I've written 2 forewords because the book was so enormous it required 2 separate forewords. But I think you'll find this is an interesting take on the idea of 9/11 as being a kind of occult ritual.
Wow. Well,
a mega ritual, as he calls it. Yeah.
What?
A mega ritual, a super ritual.
Yeah, it certainly was. There's just a lot of tension in America. They've made the Muslims the new boogeyman, and there's a lot of hatred against them, and I don't see that that's justified. I think there's other boogeymen in this country that we need to be very careful of.
Well, it's true. I mean, what's happened since 9/11 has been this act of misdirection.
Yes.
A stage magician wants you to look in one place while he's doing something in another, so you don't notice what he's really doing. And that's what this is. It's misdirection. And when we think of misdirection, we think of magicians, and magicians are people who manipulate reality. I mean, that's their role, is to understand reality first, which is a major undertaking, and then after they've understood it, to manipulate it so that the result comes out in conformity with what they want.
Yeah.
So this misdirection is part of what takes place. And this whole Islamic narrative that's gone on is an act of misdirection. It's making us look in one place while the real horror is taking place somewhere else.
Yes.
Now, your point about Muslims is well taken. I know a lot of Muslims. I lived in a Muslim country for 7 years. I travel to Muslim countries constantly. I know a lot of Muslims, and they have nothing to do with this in any way, shape, or form with the evils perpetrated by a handful of people who claim to be Muslim. Their point of view is that it couldn't be Muslims who did it, that it had to be an inside job. I mean, that's their perspective, which is really funny because then, al-Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda, then comes out and says, no, it wasn't. It was us. We did it. He's taking credit for it. He's sort of, it wasn't the Zionists. It wasn't a Zionist conspiracy. It wasn't the U.S. government. It was us. We did it. And so he's taking credit for it. He demands to have credit for it, even though other Muslim leaders have tried to blame the U.S. for it. I mean, Ahmadinejad of Iran famously blames 9/11 on, Israel, basically.
Yeah.
And that really aggravated, Al-Qaeda, who's been, insisting that they did it, that they're responsible. If it's ever proven that they were not responsible, Al-Qaeda becomes yesterday's news, their teeth are gone. They're nobody. They're nothing. So
we're in bed with Al-Qaeda. I mean, we support them and use them when it's convenient.
Well, we certainly have in the past. There's no doubt. Charles Taylor, who was recently finally arrested, the president of Liberia, right? A real madman, a real vicious bastard. There's no other word for him. Famously laundered Al-Qaeda money. And Liberia was like one of our guys, right? Liberia, we were in bed with Liberia really directly. I mean, we created Liberia.
Yeah.
And Pat Robertson was a close friend, or probably still is, of Charles Taylor, of that guy. I mean, he was, flying to Liberia all the time because Charles Taylor was saying, well, we're Christian. And that was enough for Pat Robertson. Forget the death squads. They were Christian death squads, so that's okay. So he would go to Liberia and, and befriend Charles Taylor and do a little business in diamonds on the side, as he was doing in other parts of Africa, where there was conflict taking place. And Liberia was using that opportunity to launder funds for Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda was making money off of conflict diamonds, and they were getting their funding through Charles Taylor in Liberia, which meant that, there was a connection to Pat Robertson, and with Pat Robertson to, the fundamentalist movement, the 700 Club, and, some presidential candidates, including Robertson himself, who was a presidential candidate.
Yeah.
So, you have this second and third level down from our surface reality, from our mainstream media reality, which is a manufactured reality. If you go like one or two levels down, you're getting into some very disgusting and very murky territory. If you've ever seen any film footage of the death squads in Liberia, you would be horrified, absolutely horrified at what you saw. I mean, it was some sort of transvestite rock and roll fantasy that was taking place. It was like a 1980s disco thing with guns. It was so totally off the wall and off the charts that, there's just no understanding it. And yet this was not only allowed but encouraged in Liberia and in other parts of Africa where we had this situation develop, parts of Nigeria and on and on. So you have some really serious involvement by government personnel, let's put it this way, not necessarily U.S. government. I think that, stigmatizing the U.S. government is probably just as bad as stigmatizing Islam in general. I think the U.S. government, a lot of those people who work in the government are honest, decent, hardworking people, in many cases underpaid and overworked. But you do have people in the government who have their own agendas. And once they get to a position of power, it's the power that's important. Your general bureaucrat does not have enough power to get anything done. But at a certain point, at a certain, grade scale level, government scale, GS level, you certainly have a high degree of power politically. And once you have that power, there's the temptation to use it, whether it's in the intelligence agencies, in the State Department, even in the Commerce Department, in places like that. Once you've got that power, there's the temptation to promote certain specific ends. And if you're a religious fanatic in some way, you're going to bend your power in a specific direction. You're not going to go against your faith.
Right.
So this is something that we have to look at. I mean, we can talk about the Mormons at one point, later, but the Mormons had tremendous power over the intelligence community at one point in our country.
I think they still do.
Well, they probably do.
They prefer to hire Mormons.
Sure. So you have, that is an ongoing situation. I don't want to get off track necessarily, but the idea that the government is monolithic that it's just one government is wrong. I think Obama found that out. I think every president finds out that they're not really totally in charge anymore, unless they're operating totally in sync with the power structure behind the scenes.
Right.
Once you do that, then you can get anything done that you want. Once you're following orders, basically, then you can get your agenda pushed through. But that means doing a lot of things that you were not elected to do, that you were elected not to do. And I think that's the problem that we have in government. That's why it appears to be dysfunctional. The government on the surface is dysfunctional, but there's something behind that's very functional. The Pentagon is very functional. The intelligence agencies may seem to be dysfunctional, and they may screw up from time to time. But I think there's an element within the intelligence agencies, a kind of old boys network, that's very functional. So this is where we have to look. It's silly to blame Islam in general for things that go wrong, just as it's silly to blame the U.S. government in general for things that go wrong. Find the real perpetrators. Have the commitment to the research to find out what's really going on, who's really in charge, who's really responsible for the things that happen. You want to find out about 9/11, don't blame the U.S. government in general. That's just too vague. Some guy working for the Motor Vehicle Bureau is not responsible for 9/11. Or somebody working for the Department of Agriculture probably isn't either. Look to see who really was responsible. Peel away the layers of the onion. It requires work. It requires dedication. It requires a lot of intelligence. You've got to go through and read a lot of mind-numbing documents, looking for that one name that's going to pop out, that one reference. But just like the WikiLeaks guy has been doing, and the others who've been leaking to WikiLeaks, this is what's important to do. This is what you have to do. You have to deconstruct and digest all of that to find out what really is happening. Don't be fooled by the misdirection. Don't be fooled by the magician saying, "Look over here, nothing in my hand." Don't look in that direction. You have to look where the hand is hidden, and that's where the real action is. It's not on CNN, baby.
Boy, you can say that again, and it's not on Fox either.
No, for sure.
Oh my goodness. Well, Peter Lavenda, you are charming. You really are, and you have a way of explaining and putting things that make it very understandable. Before we quit, I wanted to ask you what your take is on this alleged film that most Muslims never have seen, but word spread that there was a film that degraded their prophet, and the whole Middle East is going up in flames. Is this blowback?
Well, and we lost an ambassador in Libya.
Yes.
So people have died because of this. Now, the film, I haven't seen it either. I know there's a trailer. I think the only thing that has been seen is a trailer of the film. And I understand it would be very objectionable to Muslims. But again, I think it's an instance of misdirection. I think that, who cares if some idiot somewhere makes a film or a video or gets on YouTube and says bad things about Muslims. I mean, Muslims can easily get on YouTube themselves, and they have, and say bad things about anybody they want to.
Yeah.
Or if it's not on YouTube, there's other outlets for this sort of thing. So I'm kind of dismayed by the whole reaction to it. I think they're giving the filmmakers much too much credit, and they're actually promoting the film by this kind of action. I think they should stop this, because what they're doing is promoting this guy and making him more important than he really is. But that's another issue, and that's a more sophisticated take on this than a lot of people want, because they just want to react. And there's a lot of anger in the Arab world. I'm saying in the Arab world as opposed to the Muslim world, because I don't want to tar everybody with the same brush. But the Muslim world in general may be angry, but I think specifically the Arab world, and the Arab world has been screwed over royally by the West for so long that there's a lot of anger there. And this is a good excuse to vent some of that anger, to feel that they've been insulted, because they have been insulted for so long. They have been treated like second-class citizens of the world for so long. So there's been this attitude towards Arabs in Hollywood. They've been portrayed in a very bad way, in a very evil way, long before 9/11. So there is an attitude, a built-in attitude towards them. They know it. as they become more technologically adept and they have more access to what's been going on in the West for the last 50 years, then they're seeing more and more of this evidence, so they're pissed off. I would be too if I was in their position. But from what I understand, the actors who were in that film have all signed a document saying, distancing themselves from the film, saying that they had no idea how it was going to be used. They didn't know what the film was about. So there was something really sinister, cynical, and manipulative about the whole thing. Somebody was doing this for a political reason.
Yes, yes. My thought exactly. Is it possible that this is an op that was intended to inflame the Middle East in order to bring in more U.S. clampdown, if you will?
Look at it this way. As I said after 9/11, there's a Latin phrase they use in the legal profession, cui bono. Who benefits?
Yeah.
Who benefits from this? Okay? Regardless of who actually did it, who benefits? In the case of this film, there is one demographic that benefits from the release of this film, and that's the people who want to see a greater U.S. participation in North Africa and the Middle East. They want to see more troops there. They want to see a bigger crackdown. They want to see the Muslim Brotherhood taken out of power in Egypt, which would be kind of funny because there are far more radical groups in Egypt than the Muslim Brotherhood these days. But, this is what they want to see. They want to see direct American involvement. And who wants to see that direct American involvement? Who is that invested in all of this to want to see a massive military buildup when we, frankly, cannot afford it?
Right.
When we are having a hard time paying for Iraq and Afghanistan and, all of our military bases around the world. We can't pay for this. Where's the money going to come from? So somebody has an agenda here. And the fact that this guy made the film under an assumed name,
yes,
and there was all this skullduggery involved and all this secrecy involved in making this film, it can only be some kind of an intelligence operation. It could only have been done for some political agenda. There's no other reason for this. And the fact that the film hasn't surfaced at all, only a trailer of it, seems to indicate to me this was a finely tuned operation to keep the West focused on the scapegoat, on the evil Muslim world. And I think this is what this is all about.
I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's designed for that reason. Not to say that I agree with the violent reaction and the killing of our ambassador. Obviously not. The problem is we have a problem in our country, if you can look at it that way. We have a First Amendment that guarantees freedom of speech for the most part. And I say for the most part advisedly because there have been times when we haven't had free speech or free speech has been used against us. But the government has been clamping down on Twitter things. They've been watching our Twitter feeds. They've been looking at our websites and everything else. We know this. But anyway, we have free speech. So I found it humorous when al-Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda, said, how would you like it if, the media made fun of Christians or of Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah.
And I almost fell out of my chair because we do. Has he ever seen Family Guy? Has he ever seen The Simpsons? Has he ever seen any of this stuff? We make fun of these things all the time.
Yes.
But I think he doesn't understand it. Culturally, he doesn't understand that's what we do. He thinks that we're as monolithic as we think they are.
Yeah.
And I think it's Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
We think that they're monolithic in their actions and reactions, that they think that we're the same. They think we're a bunch of crusaders intent on creating a Christian, world government or something, which is hardly the case, right? And then we think that they are intent on establishing the caliphate in America and putting Sharia law in Wisconsin, which we haven't even had Christian law anywhere. How are we going to get Sharia, right?
Right.
So it's, all of this stuff is just smoke and it's disinformation and it's misdirection. And who benefits from this? People running intelligence operations, that's all.
Yeah, you and I absolutely agree on that. I'm telling you, it's evil.
Sure is.
Oh, Peter Lavenda, thank you very much for the time that you spend with us. And everybody, get a copy of Ratlines. Ratline, Ratline. Soviet spies, Nazi priests, and the disappearance of Adolf Hitler. And just get a copy. They can get a copy at Amazon, right?
Sure. At Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all the usual suspects. Actually, it's in the stores in Barnes & Noble as well, if they can hustle down to their store. Otherwise, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble easily.
Okay. And your new book, it's out?
I believe it's out. That's the last I've heard, is that's been shipped. I think Amazon has them now. I don't know if they're shipping them yet. I think they are. I think they just started this week. So